Like me, you probably transitioned from playing some sort of blues or rock into playing jazz, and often one of the first things that you sort of get when you're listening to jazz and that makes you explore the genre more is jazz blues. Now, for getting that sort of crossover sound, then I think this solo is the best there is. It's the perfect storm, and I never hear people talk about it, which is kind of surprising actually. It is the perfect mix of bebop lines and blues licks, and it's much more dynamic than most jazz, but I'll explain that along the way. Joe Pass just mixes that up in a really great creative way, which also demonstrates just his incredible range when it comes to the music, the tempo, the technique. Pretty much everything in the toolbox is out there. Some of it is about the notes, but there's actually a lot more going on than that. Joe Pass starts the song, Rubato just sort of setting the mood with some simple blues phrases like this. So really what's happening here is, of course, he's just playing minor pentatonic stuff, so... So that's all just G blues, just basic stuff there. Also maybe just a side note here, I think he's playing with his fingers actually. I'm playing it with a pick, of course, but when you hear it, like, there is, to me at least, and you can of course leave a comment if you don't agree with me, but I think you hear that there is this spot before each note where the finger is touching the string and muting the string, and you can just hear that like this, and that's a difference, because if you have pick, then that time is not so long, so you don't really hear that, and that's why I think this is actually played with the fingers. And then he brings in the rhythm section. So this is of course just trying to be clear and set down the tempo, and of course they pick it up right away. Probably it wouldn't have made the record if they didn't. And it's just like pretty straight ahead stuff. Kind of bluesy still, but also clearly in the chord, nothing sort of super fancy happening here. As soon as they come in, then he immediately just becomes more free, starts floating around more on top of the song, and it sounds like this. Not so much in the groove, the rhythm section is already there, and then he can play more freely on top of that. More stuff that's just really centered around playing sort of blues phrasing and using some triplets and mixing up the rhythm, not really locking in with the groove. And then he follows this up immediately just to get some jazz in there with a double time bebop line. Really just using more bebop phrasing, really digging into the chords and playing longer lines, but of course in a double time feel, so playing 16 notes on top of the swing feel. Using G diminished, like a half whole diminished or octatonic on the G7 to resolve to the C7. So this song, Joe's Blues, of the Intercontinental album is from 1970, and it has Joe playing in a trio with drummer Kenny Clare and bass player Eberhard Weber. So to me, Weber is actually much more associated with like more modern stuff, ECM recordings. So to hear him in this setting playing on an album which is just mostly standards is a bit odd, but he actually does it really well. I really like how he's playing here. I've talked about how this is one of my favorite Joe Pass albums in other videos, and as far as I can tell, they didn't actually rehearse to do this. They just had a day in the studio and Joe Pass just called some tunes, and that's what we're listening to, which actually kind of makes it mind-blowing that this album is as good as it is, because it's a really great album. The way I was introduced to this song was as homework, which was sort of scary. My teacher just copied a tape of it and told me to go learn it. And at the time, I hadn't really been listening to Joe Pass that much. I'd been checking out Wes, Ulf Orkenius, Schofield, and Pat Martino. And this wasn't really a choice on my part, it was just because people didn't tell me to check it out or tell me what album to listen to. This was before the internet, so I couldn't really Google it. This solo was really different from the other jazz blues things that I'd heard at the time. Most of the time when I'd heard jazz blues, then it was a lot faster and also a lot more dense with more eighth notes, like Parker playing Au Privave or Billy's Bounce. And at those tempos, then the solos are much more bebop lines, and most of the time the emphasis really more on the jazz side of things, with phrases weaving through the chord changes. And that's really not how Joe's Blues works, which is also kind of what makes it great, because you wouldn't expect Joe Pass to play like this, but he really nails all the floating blues phrases and really makes it interesting to listen to, really digs into the dynamics and the different flows that are available over this great rhythm section. But I also want to talk a little bit about the sound on this album, because I think this was actually, for me personally, just an important example of what a great traditional jazz guitar sound should be. I always imagined that he was using his ES-175 into a Polytone on this album, but I actually don't know what it was, what guitar or what amp he was using. But it does kind of have that Polytone vibe to me. Could just as easily be a Fender Tube amp or a Music Man. I think there are videos of him playing both of those in Europe, because this album was recorded in Germany. And I don't know actually if Polytone existed in 1970. There's also quite a bit of reverb on the guitar, and to me that sounds like a plate reverb. It doesn't sound like the spring reverb that you would have in an amp, which is good because I really don't like spring reverb that much. And I think in many ways this is also an example of like how I felt I wanted my guitar to sound. That's really something that shaped how I wanted to sound, and that's also, I guess, what you hear in my sound now. I use a fair amount of reverb, and it's never spring reverb, and it's kind of a dark, warm tone. I'm curious what you think he used, and you can hear his tone quite clearly in the intro before the rhythm section comes in. So maybe just give it a listen and let me know if you have a suggestion of what it was, or maybe you know, or you've read somewhere what he used. One of the things that I think Joe Pass does so well in this solo is how he's taking simple blues melodies and then mixing it with jazz harmony. And there are a few places where he does this. This first one I want to show you is how he's taking a very basic melody and then harmonizing it in two different ways using jazz chords. Check this out. So really, that's just a simple phrase that's repeated, so you get. And then the first time he's harmonizing with G7 and A flat 7, so. And then C7 and D flat 7. Which is just a really nice way to just take a very simple melody and then add a lot of color to it. From here, he sort of continues with another chord phrase and then into some six, and then he kind of goes into comping mode, so you have sort of these two layers to what he's playing. First, he's playing some solo phrases like this, and then he starts comping himself. This. So he comes out on the 6 intervals, and then really playing a lot softer with this, and just sort of filling it up. And also with this nice chromatic phrase on the C7. Another great example of how Joe Pass is mixing blues and jazz harmony is in bar 9 of the form. So of course Joe's Blues is a blues in G, it's a jazz blues, and normally in bar 9 you would expect to hear like an A minor 7 chord, but a few times in the solo he's actually changing this to an A7, which is fairly normal to do. It's not super strange that he does this, but he's actually using that to create an altered dominant, but then using G blues melodies on top of it to do so. And that means that he can actually play some A7 altered phrases that are not really just the standard jazz lines, but really using G blues phrasing on top of it. That sounds amazing. Check this out. So really what that is just that, of course, he's playing that A7, so we kind of have that happening in our ears, and then he's playing this, which is of course using flat 9 and sharp 9 on top of that A7. This is of course something he's also continuing with on the D7. He keeps playing sort of a G blues line that creates some tension also on top of the D7 like this. And then to get a contrast out of that, he goes into a more straight ahead G major line. Actually, he's not playing G7, really playing like tonic G major in the next phrase. So really what's happening here is that he goes into this really straight ahead bebop line, really arpeggio based, using some bebop trills. And that's just a nice sort of shift. He keeps shifting between having the blues phrases and then the bebop phrases happening. And I think that's a really great example of how he does this. So here he's really just continuing from that bebop phrase with another way of creating some variation and actually also kind of some tension. The material that he's playing, the notes, are really, really basic. So he's just playing, which is it's almost just G7 chord tones. There's nothing happening with that. But the fact that he's actually playing straight 8 notes on top of the groove is really making it more light, giving it a lot more energy compared to if he just returned to the groove and then would be playing like, compared to. So I think one thing that's very important about this is also to point out that this is only really possible because the rhythm section is playing the way that they do. So they're really not doing a lot. They're quite soft in volume. The drummer is only playing brushes all the time, and the bass player is really mostly supporting what's going on and giving Joe Pass a lot of room to do different things. Jazz guitar is not a super dynamic instrument. So very quickly, as soon as stuff gets loud, I mean, if you compare this to, like I talked about, Charlie Parker playing a jazz blues, then the drummer is playing with sticks and everything is just a lot louder. And the jazz guitar trio like this quickly kind of becomes a chamber music ensemble. So the volume is a lot lower and the drummer is really just staying very much in the background, but still interacting. You can hear him also kind of going a little bit along with the even phrases on this, supporting that, not getting in the way and not pushing the volume up, which makes it possible for Joe Pass to have that dynamic range, to do a lot more things, so that he can go into sort of these phrases that are comping himself, which otherwise you just wouldn't hear it at all. And I think that's an important thing to be aware of. It's something that sort of comes into fashion and goes out of fashion again when it comes to jazz trios. Like if you listen to Julian Lage or Gilad Hexelman trios, then they are really embracing sort of this chamber music volume and playing really soft, but then also getting to the point where the guitar player has dynamic range to really do different things. That wouldn't be possible if they were just sort of playing full out heavy jazz like you would expect from the rhythm section playing with John Coltrane. The next place that he's taking it, because now he's playing all these dense lines and he wants to change that up, is at the top of the next chorus. Check this out. A chord with the high E in the melody all the time, and then going to C7, of course, in bar 2, back to G7, and that way just making like the opposite of a bebop phrase, but still introducing something we haven't heard before, keeping it interesting. Another guitar player that I think is really good at this, that has some really strong melodic ideas, uses riffs and motifs, and also uses chords, is Wes Montgomery. And if you want to check out how he does this, then check out this video where I talk about both his single note lines and his chord solos.